Let's go with the first question.
Okay. Hi, this question is initially directed at Steve Finney. One of the problems of being not a doctor and a kind of a novice in this area is that there's so much conflicting science around what's healthy and what's not. And there's been such a persuasive case for this, low-carb, high-fat diet, which involves a lot of meat. But one of the things that I struggle with is that there is such a strong body of evidence in this anti-cancer movement, which is all about alkaline foods, reducing acidity, and going vegetarian. So many clinics that claim incredible results for healing cancer. One of the first things they do is they go off meat, and they're all about plant-based diets. And I just wonder if you could address that. Do you think all of that is just invalid? Or what aspect of that is valid, and what about acidity and poor digestion arguments around meat, which are, I think, as far as I can gather, two of the main ones that are anti-meat from a health and anti-cancer perspective?
Excellent question, but I would guess that there's, in my read of what's going on, it's about 85% emotion and 15% fact. First is, I'm not advocating what most people would call a high-protein diet. If 15% of energy intake is protein, is what probably the average omnivore would eat. And I would guess that only 2/3 of the protein for the kind of menu I showed you, 2/3 comes from meat, and a relatively small portion on average comes from red meat. So only somebody like T. Colin Campbell would call this a high meat diet. And that's because he wants everybody to be vegan. And my ancestors going back 2 million years, but to my knowledge, none of them were ever vegan. And I don't want to make light of that. But the other factor that's important is we're just now beginning to understand what it is about ketones, that it's not just fuel for the brain, but it's signaling for key processes in the body, defensive processes in the body. And a lot of the people I know who are into regulation of cancer genes, which is not an area that I have any expertise in, are asking me for advice on how to be on this diet, because they see the switching on of cancer protective processes to be quite potent. And the final point I'll make is for epidemiologic studies that link meat intake to cancer have not been done in populations where any of those people have been on the LCHF for the duration of time that they're studying it. So it's really off the scale, or outside the aperture of examination. So I really can't comment on acidity and poor digestion, because those are concepts that are more common in the lay discussion than in the scientific literature. Lay discussion includes, pardon me for offending anybody, all textbooks of dietetics, in which those things are casually commented on but not supported by science.
Is there anyone else, just before we leave that question, who's got anything to say on that?
So if you look at the main proponent for this is just T. Colin Campbell with the China study. And in fact, there's been a reanalysis of that study done by a woman called Denise Minger, and you can look on either her blog or her good book, Death by Food Pyramid, which re-examines the same data and draws quite different conclusions on meat eating. Second of all, when you look at associations and the car races that Simon so nicely spoke of, then actual meat, so meat that is not processed, fresh meat, then you don't see those associations. But you do for some other types of meat in those association studies with processed meats, which are a different thing, and we're not sure which part of it, if it's meat itself or the processing that causes it. So that's where the evidence is, as far as I'm concerned.
Could you repeat the name of the study you mentioned?
So the main study proponent the problems with meat is with T. Colin Campbell, called the China study. And the reanalysis, the exquisite reanalysis of that is by Denise Minger, Minger, and her book is Death by Food Pyramid.
Can I just make a quick comment? I don't eat any more meat now than I used to. So it's not a high meat diet. I have eggs for breakfast and I might have otherwise had breakfast cereal. I have maybe cold meat and a salad for lunch. Other people might have that on a sandwich. For dinner, I have a small portion of meat with green above ground vegetables. So it's not a high meat diet. I don't eat a lot of meat, and it's not something that worries me.
Just looking at a couple of observational studies, I can't remember exactly which ones they were, but in some of those studies where they linked meat with cancer, there was a reasonably strong correlation between the meat and sugary foods as well. And cigarette smoking, yeah. So it's difficult to tease out an observational study which one you're measuring the meat, but is it actually the 2 litres of Coke that goes with the meat that's actually causing the disease? So that to me is a really tricky thing in these observational studies, which were produced these sorts of headlines in the last 10, 15 years.
Perhaps we should give someone else a go. And thanks very much. Interesting to hear.
Hey everyone, I'd just like to say thanks again to Rod for pulling this all together. It's been an amazing day. I actually came to low carb, high fat quite recently, and I've lost a bit of weight, which has been fantastic, but the main reason I came along was actually to deal with depression. And I did some initial reading, Dr. Gabriel Cousins, around the relationship with high sugar, high carbohydrates and mental health. Just wondering, and I'm not sure who this is directed to, if anyone can give a summary view on how the relationship between insulin, cortisol and serotonin, because I haven't found a lot of literature that's really explained why there would be an improvement on a low carb, high fat diet. Pointing finger.
I've looked at that question mainly because there's quite a few studies coming out here at the moment, and I put something up on Facebook only last week about the link between depression and inflammation, and I think we're starting to see some very clear relationship between mental illness and inflammation. But I went back, 18 months, 2 years ago to try and answer that question, where does cortisol fit into that? And I couldn't find the answer. So you've asked for information, and last time I had a good look at it, I couldn't find it. Someone else might be privy to it, but there is a clear link between inflammation and mental illness. And even going back to using simple aspirin in the management of mental illness is there.
I published a paper a wee while ago looking at addiction and mental illness and the relationship with food, and I think part of it's related to the dopaminergic pathway. You certainly see there's a little bit of evidence that carbohydrates are addictive and sugar is addictive, and if you look at mental health generally, it tends to get a lot worse when, for example, psychotic illness or depression tends to get a lot worse when people binge on addictive substances. Also, people with mental illness tend to be overweight compared to the general population, and losing weight tends to improve mental health. So my hypothesis, if you like, is that part of that is related to this disordered kind of reward pathway that goes with addiction, and that diet's sort of related to that, and that I've applied for grants to do this but never got the money, that actually improving the diet of people with mental health by taking out the starch and sugar and increasing the fat helps improve the function of that reward centre, and improve mental health. So that's my hypothesis.
Thank you.
I'll just make one other comment on that. There was also, we've talked mostly about nutrition, but Z talked about some of the other important aspects, and getting a good night's sleep and keeping your, in normal circadian rhythm and exercise are really potent antidepressants, and that's part of the lifestyle as well. We shouldn't underestimate those things. I think they're really important.
Look, my experience with as a trained psychologist with medications is that we know that some medications work for, and we have no idea why for the most part. And we know for depression that these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors are only as good as placebo-controlled. In other words, taking a pill as long as you know it's a pill, which turns out to be quite effective. So, look, effects on serotonin and cortisol and how that might interact. Like, to be honest, I don't think anyone's got a clue.
Thank you for your honesty.
Thanks. Two questions to the group. Firstly, your perspective on vegetarianism and specifically vegan. Can you be healthy with that diet? And the second one is protein intake. You've talked about sort of 15 to 20%. What is your upper limit there? Does it vary depending on lifestyle? And what are the ramifications of going significantly higher?
So I mentioned that I was a pescatarian. I was also vegan for 1 year, a little before that. I think it's really, really difficult to be healthy on a vegan diet. You're not getting the omega-3 fats. You can develop deficiencies very easily unless you supplement. And I just don't think it's an optimal diet. Vegetarianism is definitely an option with, as long as you're a lacto-ovo, where you're getting eggs and dairy. I think you can do just dairy and not the eggs, but I think eggs are one of the healthiest foods on the planet, and really for an optimal diet, I wouldn't recommend anything less than lacto-ovo, and preferably actually having some fish in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think being a vegetarian, you can definitely be healthy. It's probably, you can still do LCHF being a vegetarian. I'd say it would be just a little harder, because your vegetarian protein options tend to be high in carbohydrate as well. So it really depends on your goal, and it depends on how low you want to go. And of course, if you're going as low as the ketogenic diet, it would be quite tricky. But we are very inventive, and there are ways and means we can get to that place.
Could you repeat the second part of the question?
The levels of protein. Generally, the panel has sort of talked about a 15 to 20% protein intake. So it was a two-part question. What is the top end, and does that vary depending on lifestyle and physical makeup, for example? And what are the ramifications of going up to, say, 30 or, let's say, 35% protein?
The first point is, I wish I could answer that with a solid map of good science. But as you might guess, in the realm of low-carbohydrate nutrition, it's been very hard to get the kind of grant support where you could study 4 different protein levels in 2 different genders, and half of them being athletes and half of them being non-athletes. Most athletes tend to think, and maybe it's true, that having a training lifestyle requires somewhat more protein. And there's some biology to suggest that exercising muscle does burn branched-chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, which are essential, which might increase protein requirement somewhat. But that said, in the study I did with the bike racers, which is one of the few that actually looked at protein balance, that is, total amount of protein coming in, breakdown products going out, which lets us precisely look at whether they're gaining or losing lean tissue. That implied that 1.75 grams of protein per kilogram reference body weight, which roughly translates to 15% of protein when someone's in energy balance, is adequate not just for adaptation, but for keto adaptation, but for somebody who's doing 100 to 200 miles worth of training. So that suggests that 15%, something under 2 grams per kilo, should be adequate under most circumstances. But for higher levels of training, particularly during or performance during a competitive season, it might go higher. At the level of 30%, I have concerns that 30% of one's energy intake as protein, which would put you up in the 2.5 plus grams per kilo range, 2.5 to 3, suppresses ketogenesis. So if there are benefits to ketogenesis, you're giving them up for that higher protein intake. There's higher cost. And many people start having vague gastrointestinal symptoms when they get to 30% that aren't focal, and they sometimes think, well, that's just the side effect of being on low carb, and it actually may be high protein. But again, that hasn't been adequately explored. So if you know any billionaires who have some free cash, my colleague Jeff Volek is set up to do those studies. We can get the answer to you within 2 years.
Thanks.
I've just had my hip replaced, so I'm not jumping up and down out of the seat. I think there's a lot of take-home messages here. We can get hung up on numbers, and it's not about numbers. We're all about cutting down carbohydrate. That's the first thing. And you have to replace that with something. And it's either protein or fat. Atkins, lots of historical data, going high protein is not sustainable. And there are a few rat studies, and they keep coming out saying if you eat too much meat, you're going to get cancer. And you're going to. So we're all pretty well talking about you're going to have to replace it with fat. And trying to work out how much protein is impossible, because no food stuff is just protein or just fat or just carbohydrates. It's a mixture. On a personal note, I'm sort of normal protein, and I have lots of fat. I haven't measured anything in the last few years. But what you do is, I find there's a time where I go, actually, I think I need protein today. And I know I've spoken to people about that. Actually, I think I want a protein hit today. So I'm obviously running a little bit low on it. But if I have too much protein, I actually go, oh, that doesn't feel right. So I realise that you're after a number, and I say 1 to 1.5 grams per kilo. But I don't like, actually, but I've never measured it myself. So I'm sort of where Steve is on his numbers, but don't get caught up on making it too hard for yourself.
Yeah, I wasn't really looking for a specific number. I was looking for a sort of an upper end where you'd say, once you get to that level, you are going to have impacts on your health for one reason or another. Because to me, the macronutrient ratios that you guys are putting forward are a little bit hard, because I see the fat is high and the protein is quite low. So it's not only a matter of keeping the carbohydrates low, but then when you're eating that type of meal, if you're going to eat whole eggs, you're going to eat, the meat and the fish, and if the fish is going to be things like salmon and stuff like that, and various other fish, perhaps not such fatty fish, such lean warm water fish, then it's going to turn out that really your protein ratio is going to be more like 30%, if you're eating the type of diet that most people would eat in that ratio, and whether you had any issues with it getting up to sort of towards the 30%.
If you're not insulin resistant, then that protein's not too much of an issue, but once protein still requires a bit of an insulin response. So again, it comes back to that old equation. If you're insulin resistant, you're more prone to exposing yourself to all of the problems. And effectively, if you're doing this and you're contemplating cutting down your carbs, and whether or not you're bumping it up with your protein or fat, this is a practical thing to tomorrow. You're eating infinitely better than 99% of the population, and the health benefits will come. I mean, it's a wishy-washy answer, but I'd like to keep it that way.
Right, okay.
Sorry, Rod, can I just throw in something there? My concern is when we start trying to come up with numbers, regardless of what side of camps or what belief structure you might have. If you start working with percentages, and it really should just be a focus on the food that you're eating, what you're eating, and how much of it, and try and think in absolute values. I mean, when I look at the case studies that I've read with the cancer stuff, the energy intake on any given day is quite different depending upon the individual. And that one of the areas I think that we could have gone wrong with respect to nutritional advice is coming up with standard rules for everybody to follow, and you come up with an average guideline for average diet, for average health outcome. The best way to know would be to have a feel for yourself, measure a good line of indicators, and find out for yourself what your body's going to be reacting or responding best to. And then if that's what works for you, that's what works for you, because people have different thresholds.
I'm going to throw a spanner in the works and actually disagree with you, Cameron. But I'm going to agree as well. I think for someone starting out, going with some general advice and some general foods is the way to go. But in practice, some people who want to lose some weight and who are already eating well, low carb, need to look at numbers to lose more weight. And what I tend to do is, I certainly don't give out any blanket guidelines. Every person who comes into my office gets treated as an individual, and we make a unique guideline for them. And for those of you who might be interested, in New Zealand and Australia, we've got, we share a database, and I use an app in my practice, and it's an iPhone or iPad app only, sadly, sorry for you Androids, and it's called Easy Diet Diary. And I get my clients to track their current intake, not so that they can get fixated on numbers, but rather just to get an idea of where they're at, and also more so from a learning process. So they need to learn where you find carbohydrates in food, because I'll give you a classic example. Sorry to draw this out, but my sister, who's she's a very intelligent lady, she lives in Sydney, and she decided to drop the sugar and drop the carbohydrate out of her diet. She came over to visit in April, and she said, I want to lose the last sort of 4 or 5 Ks. I don't eat any bread, cereals, pasta, rice, muesli bars, crackers, sugar, soft drinks, nothing. But I want to drop some weight. So I sat down with her with my Easy Diet Diary, and I plugged in her diet, and it came up with 230 grams of carbohydrate from fruit and from vegetables. And she had no idea. So I think from a learning curve perspective, numbers can be a good thing. And also on that protein thing, I think a lot of people don't realize that that too much protein, whatever that means, gets converted to carbohydrate. So while higher protein intake might not inherently be dangerous for the body, some of that does get converted to carbohydrate, so you end up with a higher carbohydrate profile.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I might have just not been making myself clear. I agree completely. The problem is when you work with percentages, not absolute values. So that Easy Diet Diary app is excellent. It taps into the FoodWorks database, which is an Australian and New Zealand food database, so we know it's good for our foods. It's not got contamination from other countries. But yeah, it's monitoring your absolute intake, because 230 grams of carbohydrate could be X percentage and what have you. So avoid percentages, because they're useless unless you know exactly how much you're taking in. So you need to track the absolute numbers.
I have a question on snot. I've heard on recent podcasts with Rob Wolf, Paul Jaminet, and Dave Asprey that very low carbohydrate diets can lead to problems with mucus production, things like dry eyes, gastrointestinal problems, and my interest is in synovial fluid and cartilage, so I wonder if the panel have some thoughts and opinions.
I get a lot of questions like that, and I struggle with having good answers. When I went to medical school, they spent 4 years teaching me to say I know, and then I went to graduate school just to take a few courses, but I got sucked into taking a PhD because it took them 3.5 years to teach me to say I don't know. That said, quite commonly on the dry eyes issue and dry mucous membranes, people think of, is my immune system beginning to fail, or are there things coming apart in terms of normal secretions? And the solution to that is 2 cups of broth or bouillon per day to maintain adequate circulating volume so you're not, frankly, hypovolemic. And a lot of people walk around on a ketogenic diet because they're afraid of salt, having low circulating volume. And you can get by with that until you try to exercise, and then you have this rapid pulse where you feel lightheaded, dizziness, and quit. I haven't kept count, but something like 20 people in the last year have asked me about dry eyes, and it's just as simple as 2 grams of sodium per day as a bouillon cube or a cup of broth. And let me leave it there. I apologize if that's inadequate.
Thank you, it's helpful.
I have a friend who had dry eyes, and their doctor recommended that they try just omega-3 oil supplements, and they identified that they had blocked eye ducts for one reason or another. Which, and look, I haven't followed up. I don't know if the supplements have worked or not, but that I know is a piece of advice that some people have been given for the dry eyes, but I don't know if that's specific to low carb, high fat, or the type of way they're going for it.
Thank you.
My question is more about strength and bodybuilding. I noticed that you guys make a lot of references to endurance athletes. I was just wondering where the ketogenic diet fits into building strength and muscle, whether if that means that you do a cyclical ketogenic diet, as in having carbs maybe once a week, or post-training eating some carbs, or just going strict ketogenic. What are your thoughts or recommendations?
My understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected by the panel on this, is that there's no loss of lean body mass, and in fact what tends to happen is that people on a ketogenic diet tend to strip their subcutaneous fat, so they end up leaner without losing their lean body mass. So I would have thought that it would have been advantageous.
From my knowledge, in terms of evidence, I don't believe there's any evidence looking at ketogenic diets for lean muscle mass gain. And I guess one of the reasons is because when you up your protein beyond a certain level, that gets converted to carbohydrate and kick you out of ketosis. We certainly use, and I've got students looking at some research using low carb, high fat dietary practices for manipulating body composition. That's more about reducing body fat leading up to competition and holding muscle mass, but I don't know about growing muscle.
Let me channel my co-author here. Jeff Bullock is a former competitive powerlifter. He was state champion powerlifter in Indiana in his weight category, and I think in the 1990s. The reason, and he did that while on low carb, and the reason that he could do that was the low carb finally let him comfortably make weight for his weight category while retaining, by losing body fat and retaining lean body mass, rather than going into a sauna and dehydrating himself down to the point where he made weight but he was dehydrated and poorly functioning. One of the theoretical concerns about a low-carb diet is when you go on a low-carb diet, your insulin level goes down. And we know that insulin is an anabolic hormone, not just for putting fat in the fat cell, but putting amino acids into muscle and bulking muscle. And so theoretically, people say, well, this has got to be bad for maintaining muscle mass because the insulin level is so low. What's not well understood is when one goes on a ketogenic diet and blood ketones come up, the ketones protect branched chain amino acids from being oxidized in mitochondria. So branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine go up about 25 to 30% in the first week without any increase in protein intake, meaning it's not more protein coming in, yielding more branched chains, but less destruction. And leucine, isoleucine, and valine are well-known signals for muscle anabolism. So the loss of insulin is elegantly counter-regulated by the rise in branched chains associated with nutritional ketosis. And that just goes to prove that either there is a deity that wrote great lines of code, or a billion years of multicellular organism evolution yielded some really neat processes. Bottom line is that people retain lean body mass well, and Jeff actually did a study with a graduate student named Sharman, and I think it was published in 2003, where they took a group of overweight male students and put them on a well-formulated ketogenic diet plus a reasonable amount, not a huge amount, of resistance training. And as I remember Jeff's diagram, the mean change in lean body mass was increased in spite of the fact that they lost weight. And 1/4 of the subjects gained, I think, more than 5 kilos of lean body mass in the course of a 3-month weight training study. So it is possible for at least some subfraction for the group as overall to gain lean tissue, and some of them gain quite a bit. And again, that's the only study I know of resistance training during a well-formulated ketogenic diet.
Hello, my name is Rory Robertson, also known as ozparadox.com. I came to this space as an economist who'd observed an extraordinarily faulty paper that came out of the University of Sydney that claims that there is an inverse relationship between sugar consumption and obesity, which obviously is nonsense. But as I've read over the past couple of years, and as we've all seen today, that is just the tip of the iceberg of incompetence in the nutrition space over the past 50 years. And the panel has demonstrated today that something like 1/4 to 1/3 of all adults in the Western world have aspects of metabolic syndrome. The panel has demonstrated today that a low-carb, high-fat diet is uniquely successful in improving all aspects of metabolic syndrome. So it reduces obesity, it reduces blood pressure, it reduces triglycerides, it boosts the HDL cholesterol, it boosts LDL particle size. There's nothing else that comes close. And so obviously, in our opinion, I think the low-carb, high-fat diet is maybe the most important thing that's come to the public health space. I don't have a question. I would simply like to thank the panel and encourage the panel for its profoundly important efforts in boosting public health in Australia and globally, and particularly people like Dr. Finney, who's been at nose to the grindstone for 40 odd years. Professor Dr. Finney, just stay alive. If you stay alive on your diet for the next 30 or 40, 50 years, you will be vindicated, sir.
Dr. Finney is, we're going to present him with a bath, and he's going to bathe in beta-hydroxybutyrate externally as well.
Anyway, a big fat good on you all.
Thank you for allowing me back from intellectual Siberia.
Hi, my question is more based on for education or anybody who is looking at changing their careers or furthering their education in this field as well. I'm studying nutrition at the moment, and then hopefully when I graduate, opening a weight loss and wellbeing clinic for basically all low carb, high fat. Basically just wanting to, at the moment I'm like really confused, I guess, with the conflicting science and coursework that we have, because I basically, you got your coursework in front of you, it's saying all the old things as well. I know you need to learn those things, but also trying to compare them with all the new books that I got, like my Primal Body, Primal Mind, all those keto adaptation books and things like that, and also struggling and trying to do it myself. But at the same time, is there any pointers or any kind of extra resources that you could point people at my level of of education trying to break through that you wish was available when you guys were studying?
I think you want to find out all you can, and you want to work it out for yourself. So I'd recommend pushing it to the max to do an N=1 on yourself. And I think that will be a great experiment. You will learn a lot from it. And then you can weigh up the alternative things that you're being taught in the light of your own experience of having really giving low carb, high fat, ketogenic a good go. Because you are going to be taught all sorts of things which don't fit with this. Lots of people doing lots of courses are taught things which are out of date or are not correct. And I think this is something we guess we've all got to learn to be critical of the things that we're taught. And work out what we think the truth is?
Half of what we know is wrong, and we need to figure out which half. And that's always the hard part, isn't it? If I was going to recommend a single book, it's Steve and Jeff's book, because it's designed it's not a romance novel. It's a what some of that. But it's a book for the health professional as well as the intelligent layperson. It's the go-to.
Do you have the book? Do you have that book?
I don't know. I was going to purchase one today, but you ran out.
You're getting question of the day, I think.
Now, I think we can take one more question. The town hall staff have been fantastic, but I think we said we would be out of here very soon. So, one more question.
Can I just say one last thing to that lady? I would really encourage you to, once you do your reading, to challenge your tutors and your lecturers and tell them what you're reading and see what their counter arguments are.
So I support that entirely, but as an academic lecturing within a degree where I teach people biochemistry, and I was telling Tim last night, I was very excited to meet him because I teach a module on mechanisms of fatigue, and I've been teaching his central governor model at the same time as the role of carbohydrates, at the same time as where lactate fits into the scheme. And so they do biochemistry with me, but then they go into another unit taught by a dietitian where ketones cause acidosis and dangerous, where it's all about carbohydrates and it's not about psychology and motivation and things like that. So that's a challenge from the academic point of view to make sure our curriculum aligns. Your role as a student at the moment, as awful as it might sound, is you can challenge your tutors, but they're marking your exam. They're setting the learning outcomes. So my awful pragmatic approach to you at the moment would be, when you're in exams, do what you've learnt in class, but do not let that influence your own personal growth. Okay?
It's all about credentialing. I'm sorry for everyone doing nutrition at this point in time. You are going to prostitute yourself to get your degree. I've had 4 young doctors come to me in the last month or so saying that they're struggling in their career because they believe in low carb, high fat, yet their senior consultants are recommending write them up for a statin, write them up for this, write them up for that. And they're struggling to work out what they can do because they want a job next year, they want to get onto a training scheme, all that sort of thing. And I get this question all the time about what course can I do to go further and then have a credential that you can then stick your flag up. And there isn't that at the moment. There is a course in the US, costs about 30 or 40,000, which you can do sort of online and then have to go and do a few training courses around the world. That's about all that's available at the moment, sorry. But I think it is a matter of being aware, questioning the system all the way along, and that is put up today. If you're a true scientist, you don't trust what you're actually doing. You're constantly questioning. And this is the transition zone, and this is where I honestly don't believe we'll be teaching this, the current, module of the food pyramid, in 5 years' time. Pete Evans talked about 2 or 3 generations. We can't wait that long. But it's happening now. My students are questioning their lecturers, and that's what I want. And just hang in there to those students who are out there at the moment.
I know Troy wants to say, so I just want to say one other thing. There is a reason why that is the case, because this is being recorded and I don't want to get fired. The way in which the education system is set up for like an allied health profession is that a good portion of the curriculum can be governed by the accrediting body. So if we can't prove that we're teaching certain competencies, then that degree doesn't get accredited. So with respect to professional degrees like that, a lot of it can be governed by external sources. There is some freedom for electives and what have you. So it's a challenge for the tertiary education as to how they resolve that. And that's why I say, well, you're going to have to do what you need to do to get through the degree, but the way to change that is actually to change what those competencies are that influence the curriculum.
just really quickly, I'm very, I think everything should start with our evolutionary history and our basic biology, our basic biochemistry and our basic physiology, and work from there. And when you hear something that doesn't make evolutionary sense, it doesn't make sense. So when someone tells you that whole grains are essential, you should test that against our evolutionary history and say, well, the Polynesian people didn't eat whole grains and they were robustly healthy. How does that make sense? The Plains Indians didn't, and that's always my test.
Last question, Ron, thank you.
Very quickly, I just want to know, it's slightly provocative, but I think you know what I'm getting at. If I'm an accredited dietitian, and if I open a practice in the centre of Melbourne, and I put on the front of my shingle, low-carb dietitian, will anything happen? I mean, what's the problems legally? Because it's such a powerful message. And then if I put on my shingle, low-carb, high-fat dietitian, what happens to me legally and perhaps in accreditation? I was very happy to hear that Francisca has a shingle, if you like to call it that, as a low-carb dietitian in New York, which made me very happy. I'm just wondering what would happen in Australia, because it's such a powerful message to have that in your name.
I don't know what would happen in Australia.
I would happily be low carb, high fat in a name in New Zealand, because I'd be prepared to take on what was coming to me, but based on the fact that I feel completely confident with what I'm doing, and it doesn't breach the code of ethics in any way. And I have been through the Australian code of ethics as well, and I don't believe it breaches anything either. But I don't know about the DAA beast, and I hear that it's more beastly than the New Zealand one. So if I were you, I would do it. I really think, and I'm sort of true to what I'm saying here, is that if they were to investigate you, so to speak, or want to kick you out, I don't think they'd have any good standing to do that. But if they do that, you need to question whether you actually want to belong to that kind of group anyway. So that's a personal thing as to whether you are prepared to get kicked out. I think from a business perspective, you'll be way busier. So I'd encourage you to do it.
Great. Look, on that note, I think we should thank all our speakers, and looking forward to the next occasion. Thank you.